Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 93 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Last week, in episode 92, we discussed how historians research online and how computers and the internet have changed the ways they work. This week, we get to see some of that information in action, because we're going to explore the history contained within a new, free-to-use digital history archive called the Colonial North American Project. This project is the Harvard University Library's attempt to digitize and link all of its historical records about early America so that everyone who wants to can make use of them. Taylor Stoermer, a visiting fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Colonial North American Project team, will lead us on our exploration through this digital archive. During our conversation, Taylor reveals what the Colonial North American Project is and details about some of the historical records it contains, the history of the Harvard University libraries, and John Hancock's relationship with Harvard, and how the Harvard University libraries digitizes materials for the Colonial North American Project, and how we can best navigate this new digital collection. But before we investigate this interesting resource, have you joined the Ben Franklin's World community? It's on Facebook, and next week, it's the place where I will host my largest book giveaway yet. If you love history and free books, you need to join the Ben Franklin's World community. Membership is free, and all you need to do is visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the orange Join Now button on the home screen, or text BF World to 33444 to get the link. I'm excited. Are you? Last week, we talked about how historians research online, and this week, we get to explore a digital project that contains not only interesting stories about history,
With tidings
but
and
a project
wisdom
that
to
will
share
allow you
about
to
our
try your
early
hand at
American
conducting
past.
online
Here
research
is
if you
this
want
week's
to.
special guest.
Our guest teaches public history at Harvard University, where he is a visiting fellow at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. He researches colonial America and the British Atlantic world, and he is presently working on a book about the Loyalist experience in revolutionary America. Today, he joins us to discuss the Colonial North American Project at the Harvard University Libraries. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Taylor Stoermer.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be in it.
Taylor, let's talk about colonial North America, because as a period, it covers almost 300 years of history, and as a geographic description, it evokes a mental map of a vast place. So, what do the Harvard University Libraries mean by colonial North America, and what is the Colonial North American Project?
It's a big concept. It's a big place. Harvard is a big place. But in general, it is an effort to connect our massive holdings to one another and also to make them accessible to everyone. In particular, our goal is to digitize everything we have from 12 repositories that relates to the university's earliest period, which is the 17th and 18th centuries, before there were any borders drawn on a map. So it's this massive endeavor that captures the history of North America and, frankly, the Atlantic world. So the term Colonial North America Project is intentionally broad and intentionally vague, so that as we continue to go through this process of digitizing these documents, trying to understand them, we can perhaps better understand what we mean by any of those words.
How many holdings are we talking about? How many books, manuscripts, and other documents about colonial North America do the Harvard University Libraries have to digitize?
From 12 repositories across several libraries in the university, and within each of these repositories, we're talking about everything from the Andover Harvard Theological Library to the Baker Library, which is at the business school, the university archives, the Houghton Library, which is our rare books and manuscripts collection, the law school library, the music library, and then within those are various collections. So right now, if you were to go onto the website right now, you'd see that we've digitized about 5,236 different collections, and we're up to well over 150,000 manuscripts, and that number grows every single day.
The Harvard University Libraries now number 12, but when Harvard began in 1636, it had just one library. Taylor, would you tell us about this first library and how it grew to become 12 libraries, all with assorted historic materials?
That's a great question, Liz. From one became many as the university grew. And frankly, history of the development of the university libraries is as interesting and as reflective of the development of higher education itself. So at Harvard, originally, we might want to think of it as the theological library, as the divinity library. 2/3 of all the books by the middle of the 18th century, at least by the time that the Harvard Library burns, were theological in orientation. And obviously, Harvard is established as a theological school. But it is as the university grew, particularly in the 19th century, that they start carving out different parts of the library as different schools are established. I mean, Harvard, obviously, like many other universities, it's really now a collection of so many different schools, each with their own libraries and each with their own budgets. But the way it originally develops is that first the law books get carted out for the development of the law library in 1817. And then later on in the 19th century, there's a separated divinity library that happens in 1826. So that's separated out. And then it gets carved out when there's the creation of the business school in 1908. And then the creation of the Poten as being a place where to especially focus on rare books and manuscripts. So that happens in 1938. So as the university continues to grow and as separate schools become established, that one founding library, which was for a college with 9 students and 1 instructor, now becomes 12 different repositories for 20,000 students and thousands of instructors and researchers, all with their own librarians, with their own separate budgets, and with their own trajectories.
In episode 75, Peter Drummey revealed how archives work. He showed us how the histories and missions of archives determine the documents, books, and other materials they collect and curate. Taylor, would you tell us how the history of the Harvard University libraries has shaped their collection of historic materials?
Yes, these are concentric circles of history within each of these libraries. I mean, it's a wonderful point because each of these libraries, as they develop, whether it's the law library over the course of the 18th century, the medical school library is a part of this, that they tend to reflect the intent of individual donors, the specialization of these individual schools, but primarily what are the pedagogical goals of the deans, of the librarians, of the curators to accomplish what they need to do to fulfill their mission. So, for example, the law school began in the early 19th century. That law library began in 1817 by making sure that every student could check citations that they found in Blackstone's commentaries, that being the primary legal text that they were learning from. So the goal of the law library is to make sure it has the resources available so that students can go into it and check every single citation in Blackstone's. And that's what it was until about 1841. Then after that, when Christopher Columbus Langdell is appointed the first dean and hires the first full-time librarian of the law school, that whole trajectory changes because they want to forget about textbooks at that point, and they want to focus more on collecting law reports. When they want to start collecting documents that reflect both the practice and the theory of law. So they start using their new unique budget to acquire a number of major collections from other places that will influence that. So it completely changes the trajectory of what the law library is. And then similarly over at the business school, the Reis Collection, which is a fund that's established in 1938 that is used to acquire extraordinary material about the background of business and industry, meaning dating back into the 15th and 16th century. It's diverse, but it is also extraordinarily wide. So it has 37,000 texts alone in that collection, all because there was a donor who made his money, I think, in the dime store trade in order to give the business school the wherewithal to produce these collections that end up, like I said, being fairly diverse. So that is both a combination of the intent of a variety of different librarians and deans, as well as the intent of particular donors who want to support any of the individual schools. So by 2015, 2016, what we end up having are a number of libraries that have each its own collection history. And over that period, from going from that one library, have drifted apart to a point where they're not necessarily connected to each other. So that you could have something, for example, like the Hancock papers, elements of which are spread out between the university archives and the Houghton Library and the business school and even the theological library, all of which are related to each other, but none of which you could actually connect in a proper research method unless you went to those individual libraries.
Now that we know a bit about the history of the Harvard libraries and how they've curated their collections, let's explore some of the collections within the Colonial North American Project, which we can access at home from our computers. This historical database project contains papers and materials authored by some of the most famous Americans, like John Hancock, who Taylor just mentioned. Taylor, would you tell us more about Hancock and his relationship with Harvard?
Hancock's relationship with Harvard is long and distinguished and contested. He first got there when he was 13 as a student. He got there as a pre-undergraduate and graduated with the class of 1754. Then in 1773, he becomes the university's treasurer, and he remains the university's treasurer until about midway through the Revolution. Obviously, we know that he's got a lot of other things on his mind during the Revolution, being president of Continental Congress, probably high on that list. So the relationship becomes a bit, shall we say, frayed during that period because he not only has custody of the university's records, but he also has custody of about 15,000 pounds sterling worth of the university's securities. So people start getting a little worried about that while he's away in Philadelphia. So in between there, he is responsible for certain things like it was his uncle's wish that he pay to replenish the Harvard Library when it burned with a particular bequest. So he does that. It goes a little beyond that, too. He not only replenishes the library, but he also redecorates the entire building. So we have the records of the wallpaper he puts on the walls. In fact, we have pieces of that wallpaper. So he goes even further than that. Like John Hancock is not exactly somebody to go halfway in anything. And then, of course, after the Revolution, he is the recipient of one of the first honorary doctorates that Harvard bestows. So the relationship has been repaired by then. But the relationship lasts for most of his life.
I love that John Hancock redecorated the Harvard Library. I wish he were still around to redecorate my library. You've given us a great preview of some of the records that Harvard has by and about John Hancock, but what other types of records does Harvard have by and about him? I'd love to know what types of records we can access at home through the Colonial North American Project.
Well, gosh, if you just type in John Hancock, you'll find records from almost every single one of the repositories that we have. Because the digital collection is so rich and varied, we're able to actually pull now parts of collections that deal with him from the business school that can be found in his family's letter books and in the university archives, of course, with the records of not only him as a student, but also him as a treasurer in the corporation minutes. And there are papers that are related to the people who populated his world, the documents that he signed for appointing officers, the diaries of his physician, in fact. A guy named David Townsend are in the collection of our medical school, so we get to see how he was treated in Boston for 20 or 30 years. There are the records that are in the university archives that reveal that he invited a local slave named Titus to some of the parties he had as a student. We get to know the kind of things that we had for breakfast and lunch and dinner. Beer at breakfast, cider at lunch, more beer at dinner, which probably explains the parties in the evening. But this extraordinarily rich and varied documentary source, I think, is able to give us a much richer understanding of everything that's going on around John Hancock, and not just Hancock himself. So it's business ledgers, it's account books, it's personal correspondence, such as he has with his sister, which is extraordinarily rich. He keeps complaining that she doesn't write to him enough, even though she lives close by. But it digs in deeper and gives us a much broader and more interesting understanding of the world there on the brink of the Revolution.
Using John Hancock and his records as an example, Brian would like to know how we can navigate and use these digital collections. How do we navigate the Colonial North American Project if we want to see these records about and by John Hancock?
Well, we're trying to improve that every day. And in fact, right now, one of the biggest things that we're in the midst of is finding a way to make that more effective. Right now, you can go to our site, which is at colonialnorthamerican.library.harvard.edu or library.harvard.edu/colonial, both of which are too unwieldy for words. We're trying to make that a bit more user-friendly. Once you get into that, though, it's exceptionally easy. Our search function is pretty basic. The keyword search tends to be terribly effective, and the browse function actually tends to be very interesting and brings you the most interesting and perhaps unexpected things to come out of the collection. But within the search function, the best way to try to put together a targeted search is by using the advanced function, especially by keyword search, which is pretty good. But like I said, we are right now in the middle of coming up with ways to make that much, much more effective. So any kind of ideas or suggestions that your listeners have would be welcome.
You mentioned that the project has an advanced search function. Would you tell us about that function and how we can use it to maximize our ability to find the information we seek?
Right now, for anybody who is doing research online, this is a challenge for us in understanding not just digital pedagogy, but how we put together research plans online so that we don't create a new myth of the archives, a myth of the digital archives, that just because something missed our particular search string, it doesn't exist. That's the discussion that we're having right now. How can we construct fields that will allow people to maximize the kind of materials that are brought up with particular searches without overwhelming them so that they become unmanageable or without giving them too little? Right now, I think the best way is to make sure that people who are delving into the collection are very clear about the kind of questions they want it to answer. And that can be very broad. For example, if you're interested in women in a collection, one particular way that one of my students went about it was to put into the keyword search the most common name in the 18th century English Atlantic world, which was Elizabeth. And it comes up with about 37, 38 different documents that refer to a woman named Elizabeth. That's an interesting way to go ahead and go about doing it. You can also search by date, you can search by topic, but that ends up for us being much more effective, I think, right now, using the keyword search and making sure that's as clearly defined as possible and as creative as possible, then perhaps using a number of the other fields. For example, our tag function doesn't work terribly well because we haven't added too many tags.
It's both great and curious that you used to search for women as one of your examples. Because in early America, institutions of higher learning, like Harvard, were really male spaces. However, just because a space was male doesn't mean that women didn't participate or have a role in these places. In fact, the Colonial North American Project proves this point because it contains records that show how integral women were to Harvard's day-to-day operations. Taylor, would you tell us more about the role women played at Harvard during the 17th and 18th centuries?
Oh, gosh. I think that there are very few places that women weren't influential at Harvard in 17th and 18th centuries. I mean, I think we have to be very careful of thinking of our 18th century universities, whether it's Harvard or William and Mary, as almost monastic, as being male-only spheres. Now, perhaps that was true inside the classroom, but outside the classroom, particularly in Cambridge, women were everywhere in the daily lives of the students. They were there as intellectual collaborators and helpmates to husbands and sons and brothers, but they were there most clearly as people who worked there, as the people who did the cleaning and did the cooking. They are in every single building at every single part of the day and at every single part of their life. They are free, they're black, they are at some level of servitude, they're white, they are all over the place, and they represent a fairly wide range of the social sphere.
So, say we go to the Colonial North American Project website and we use its keyword search function where we type in women at Harvard or Elizabeth or other female names. What types of records will the database pull up for us?
Again, it's pretty wide. You can have, for example, if you're looking for the records regarding labor and women at Harvard in the 18th century, those records are fairly complete and they can be found all over the place, particularly in the university archives, where we can find out what they did, how much they were paid. We can find out who they were, when were they hired, what did they look like, what did they sound like, what kind of trouble did they get into, what kind of relationships did they have with the rest of the university, how do they fit in with the daily daily life. So we can find out about the servants and the employees of the university and the minutes of the corporation. But we can also find out a whole bunch of other things about women, which is one of the strengths, I think, of the collection. We can find out things like from the law school library. There is midwife's testimony from 1727. There's poetry from the 1780s over in Houghton. There is the sale of a slave by a woman named Martha Dye in 1770, witnessed by several other women. So we can get inside the ownership of other people by women in 18th century Massachusetts. So what we're able to do is, again, if the search is performed effectively, there is a way to actually tap into all of these incredible sources. I mean, even including things like John Hancock's correspondence with his sister, which says an awful lot about the kind of things that his sister is doing in Boston, not that far away, that's keeping her from writing Kent.
I'm struck by just how diverse the records of the Colonial North American Project seem. I mean, during the course of our conversation, you've mentioned poetry, legal documents, account books, and ledgers. This leads me to wonder, does the project have a particular strength in its collection offerings?
I think that its strength is its scope, and because that scope expands every day. Oddly enough, the greatest strength of the collection is what doesn't have anything to do with Harvard. It is what it has to show and tell us about the broader English Atlantic world in that period. So it is its scope, its depth, and its diversity. And like I said, grows every day, but it's also part of the challenge of being able to open it up effectively for scholars of all different levels.
Now that you mention it, we have sort of limited our conversation to records about Harvard. And this digital collection contains so much more information than that. Before our interview, you mentioned that you became involved with the project as a researcher, a user like us. Would you tell us about the type of information and records you set out to find within this digital archive?
Yeah, it started with one guy, this kid named Charles Jones, who was from Weston, Massachusetts, and he was killed in 1781 in battle outside of Williamsburg, Virginia. He was a Harvard student who became a loyalist and joined the British Army. And I was always intrigued by that question. Why does this 17-year-old Harvard student in the middle of the war, when things are fairly quiet in Massachusetts, certainly in Cambridge, why does he leave Harvard the year before he graduates, goes all the way to New York, joins the British Army, fights, and dies and is buried someplace in Virginia? That intrigued me. So that was one of the things I wanted to find out. So I went into the university archives and I started looking up Charles Jones. And there's obviously some very interesting things about him and about his cohort in the minutes of the corporation, when he arrives, who he's rooming with, when he gets his bills paid. The fact that he and his brothers and his friends request to attend the Church of England across the street rather than listening to the Reverend Langdon's sermons every Sunday. So through that, and then through the collection, I was able to connect him with not only his immediate peers and find out what was the world in which he made these choices that his colleagues and his classmates weren't making. Then I found his classmates were, in fact, making those choices. They were just making them earlier. There were plenty of loyalists among the Harvard student body at the time. And then through the Colonial North America Project, I was able to find his brother-in-law, who was a graduate of Harvard and went on to become a congregational minister. And I was able to find some of his sermons and the fact that he participated in one of the first food fights in recorded Harvard history, the Great Butter Battle. And then find out more about his sister, Mary, who apparently broke one of his brothers out of jail in Concord, Massachusetts, after he was arrested for being a loyalist. And then find out in another part of the collection that records all of the books that were taken out of the library by students and find out exactly what he was reading at the time. What was his brothers, who also turned out to be loyalists, reading that were influencing their thoughts? So a separate, different collection. And then the Divinity School collection and looking at the sermons. And then another collection that actually took me to his great-nephew, who was Henry David Thoreau, and to try to understand a little bit more and see that there is a great deal of loyalist influence in Thoreau's works that comes so much from his family and his family's material culture, and that Thoreau himself admits. So it ends up being these dots that the collection was able to start connecting for me before I even know that those dots were there to connect. And that was in finding these things that I didn't know were there because the collections had never before been tied to one another. Even 5 years ago, it would have taken me more than a year in order to be able to find them. And that's if I would have thought that there was anything at the divinity school or at the law school or at the business school that might apply to my particular search for this one teenage loyalist in the 1780s.
Taylor, your search sounds like something of an odyssey. I mean, you started with a Harvard dropout, you typed his name into the Colonial North American Project search bar, and then the archive gave you records not only about Charles Jones, but also records that you wouldn't have thought to look for and that spoke to Jones's life and family.
That's exactly what happens. And that's exactly what it feels like. So there is a lot of self-discipline that one has to impose upon oneself when one goes into a collection as rich and diverse as this. That from one question can come 12, can come 20, can come a myriad of them. It is this odyssey. So you have to make sure you've got a pretty clear roadmap of where you want to go. But as with the best of all odysseys, particularly the best of all research questions for scholars, it will definitely lead you to a place you never expected to end up. And that always is, I think, the best result.
The Colonial North American Project is a fascinating archive. And another idea that fascinates us is how historians and archivists create digital collections like the Colonial North American Project. Tom would like to know about the process of digitization. How do the Harvard libraries decide which records to digitize? And Logan would like to know how the Harvard Libraries digitizes the records it selects.
In terms of the process of digitization, we're very, very fortunate to have a terrific team of folks at Harvard who can do it all in-house. That the level of knowledge and expertise that our technical teams have for digitizing these collections and for also not just digitizing them, but for repairing them and preserving them to the point where they can be digitized and then they're stable for future use. This is all part of a piece. You can't just take a lot of particularly our older pieces that are themselves in danger and just digitize them and call it a day. They've got to go through the broader process of preservation. And so we're extraordinarily fortunate to be able to have that kind of skill and expertise in-house. So we can go through our very, very large database of individual collections that we've already identified that should go into this broad Colonial North America project. And they'll just go one by one, first evaluate the condition of it, see whether or not it's suitable for the digitization process. And then if it's not, make sure that it is corrected and preserved. And if it is, then to go ahead and send it through. The bigger question and the tougher one is the one about how do we do this? And what do we do next? For the Colonial North America Project began, of course, where all good stories start, at the beginning. So the decision is made that we look at our earliest and most endangered materials, thinking that these are going to be synonymous with one another. What we'd like to do right now, and what I keep thinking about, is to reconsider what culturally endangered means. That it might not be for us just to look at what is next chronologically, not just look at the 19th century. So we start digitizing all of the Alcott papers, and our 19th century collections are going to be even more massive than our 17th and 18th century collections. So maybe, though, it's not just as simple as looking at it chronologically, that we step back and we think about priorities in a different way. And if we think about things that are culturally endangered, then maybe it's important for us to, and this is my personal belief and one I keep bringing up, is that we should take the opportunity to consider relevance and the importance of preserving what really is at risk. And I'm here talking about the women's history records at Harvard, which can go all the way from the 17th century through to today. Our Native American records, which can cross a number of different chronological boundaries, our records relating to African Americans, that maybe we should take a step back and think a bit more creatively about what exactly that means. So what's next? Probably the 19th century. That's the easy choice, but I hope that we have a discussion that makes some better and even if perhaps harder choices about what we digitize next.
Wow. Harvard has a lot of collections, and it sounds like they have some wonderful, if difficult, decisions to make about what collections to digitize next. Now, let's go back to Logan's question. Say you find a ledger book that lists a lot of the female laborers who kept Harvard running during the 17th century. the Colonial North American Project team has decided that this ledger book needs to be digitized, and the Harvard archivists have already established that the book is in good enough condition to undergo the digitization process. What does that process look like? How does the team digitize that ledger book? Are there cameras? Is there software? How do you make the ledger book keyword searchable?
I wish that I knew about that entire process and could explain it, but the people that we have are so knowledgeable at each step of that process, because that's exactly what happens. It goes to our cameras. We have a team of people who handle that part of it in terms of the initial processing. In order for it to be digitized, obviously it's different for a book than it is for a manuscript, but we make sure that it is photographed in a way that doesn't do any harm whatsoever to the document or to the other materials that we have, a piece of wallpaper. Then it goes to another team, and that team is housed over at our libraries, which then goes through the steps of rendering it accessible online by adding onto it all of the tombstone information that we generally associate with it. That can make it searchable. So our team at the library that is responsible for that is working every day. We now have interns. We also have a group of fellows. The team has grown in order to make sure that we're providing the right information so that people can find it, because in the end, that is the absolute most important thing. What we don't want to happen with this collection is for it to be yet another digital collection that is available online. And we don't want it to be something that has very little data attached to it so that much of it cannot be found. What we want is for this collection to move. We want it to influence scholarship, whether it is a fifth grader or whether it is an advanced researcher, that we want this to be in classrooms either at Harvard or at your local high school. And that's the way it has its greatest value. So the toughest job, I think, in this entire process might not be digitization, even though that might be the most technologically difficult. The toughest job, I think, is in all of the people who have the responsibility for putting together the information that will make it useful, that will make it findable, that will make it accessible. And that's a word that we keep repeating to ourselves, is we want to increase the accessibility of this collection. We're lucky that right now we have shifted to a new reader called Mirador that enables for researchers to manipulate the materials a lot better, to be able to really get up close to examine them and to be able to save the citations. So we have a solid platform there for reading them, but we must continue to improve our ability to enable others to use it, to promote its utility, to improve its visibility. And frankly, what we want to do is maybe establish a new set of best practices for how to go ahead and conduct these kinds of projects, and perhaps do it in partnership with other institutions, particularly when it comes to things like perhaps the most useful collaborative tool that we have when it comes to digital projects, which is understanding and employing metadata. And to be able to have not only a metadata system that works for our own collections, but perhaps develop one that speaks to collections at other institutions. So, for example, the Plymouth Plantation is now in the process of digitizing their extraordinary collection of archaeology and of documents. And they are thinking about these questions, too, about how do you make them accessible to the largest number of people. And so maybe there's an opportunity there for us to start coming up with a new metadata development system that connects our taglines with their taglines, so that when people are doing research and coming through, being a new web hub that we're creating at Harvard for this, that it's not just pulling material out of our collections, but it's also able, if you're interested in women who are working in particular contexts in the 18th century, that if you can find that one document that really fits at Harvard, then is there a way that we can, through the metadata, connect you easily without sending you to a gajillion other different websites, that can connect you easily with the same kind of documents available at other repositories.
Here in our 21st century, historians do like to use the term metadata when they talk about digital collections and archives. And to be clear, metadata is the information we attach to each digitized document or object that tells users and the computer what the document or object is, who created it, when they created it, and other pertinent information that a user of a digital collection might type in when they perform a keyword search.
That's absolutely correct. And that puts a lot of responsibility on the part of the person who is initially creating that information, because we are all informed by our biases, we're informed by our education, we are informed by the amount of time we actually have to go through something. So that's why I think it is every bit as important to at least some extent a collaborative process. And again, that's another tough nut to crack in digital history. What is the point at which we are able to develop teams and communities that are outside of our particular institutions to be a part of that process? A lot of folks will engage in group-sourced transcription and things like that. Well, that helps a great deal, but it is that basic information that we use to attach them to our materials so that other people can find them. That is probably the most important yet the most subjective step in the whole process. Now, some of it is objective. Some of it can be about dates and who a letter, for example, is sent to, who it's sent from, where it's sent from, those kind of things. But after that, it starts getting a lot tougher. And especially when you have so many documents. How do you make sure that you are doing each of them justice? Because it is very easy when you have that number of documents for one six to not get the attention they deserve and then perhaps get lost in the digital archives and not found unless there is the lucky online researcher who has put in just the right information in their search string in order to pull it up. So we've got to find a better, more clear way of providing that information.
So say we go to the Colonial North American Project website. We type in our search term and we come up with a document that we like. Let's say it's a poem. How does the project render that poem for us? Will we see it in someone's handwriting? Will there be a transcript of that handwritten poem? What will we see on our monitors?
Well, right now you're going to see the actual document. Our reader will be able to provide it for you, and you'll be able to expand that and go into it as deeply as you want. Our ability right now to transcribe those documents is at its early stages. We want to make sure that that transcription is correct, and that's, again, the kind of thing that we might want to look for opportunities to group source. But the most important thing that we want to do is get an online reader as close as possible to the experience that a reader in our manuscript reading room would have with interacting with that document or piece. Even if they're in California or if they're in Calcutta, we don't care. We want to make sure that we can replicate that experience as closely as possible. And to us, that means getting as close to an image of the actual document as you can, so that you can flip it back and forth, so that you can go easily from one page to another, so that you can grab our virtual optimizer and blow it up so that you can look at it really closely and look at the fibers in the paper or the watermark on the paper or look at what the marginalia might be. So that right now is our priority. We're trying to provide as much contextual information as we can for each of these documents, but our main priority is to make sure that we can really get the online reader and researcher as close to the document as if they were on campus at Harvard Yard.
Taylor, we've had a wide-ranging conversation. Perhaps it's even as vast as the scope of the Colonial North American Project itself, because we've talked about the history of the Harvard libraries, we've talked about John Hancock, we've talked about the women who made Harvard run, and we've talked about digitization and how historians and archivists create digital archives like the Colonial North American Project. But now, we need to talk about the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if John Harvard had not bequeathed his 400-book library and 779 pounds sterling to New College, or the College at Newtown, in 1639? How would the history of the university and what we know about early American history because of its library collections be different?
A library is the heart of any institution of learning. And had there been no library, there wouldn't have been any university. And so, as with all post-factuals, we can only answer that by acknowledging what Harvard is today. And I think that Harvard is one of the great centers, not just of learning in the world, but perhaps even more importantly, of inquiry, of asking questions to which our world needs answers or that otherwise would be lost. And as a global society, we'd be the poorer for it. So I don't think if you have a library, you don't have a Harvard. If you don't have a Harvard, you don't have a robust community of scholars and students who are continuing to ask questions to which we don't yet know the answer, but which we need to.
What's next for the Colonial North American Project? And when do you think the project will complete its digital archive?
Well, what is it next? We're now entering the most exciting part, although we probably have, at our latest count, maybe about 15 to 20% of our identified collections left to digitize, and that's still tens of thousands of documents. I think that the most exciting thing is how we make it useful, how we make it more accessible, how we go ahead and deploy this incredible resource and get it into people's hands. We are creating ways for us to deploy them into our own courses on campus, particularly our history lab courses in the history department. But that can't be it all. I mean, it can't just be about what goes on with it at Harvard. We've got to make sure there's a big community element to it. So we're creating workshops for scholars in the community who can use it, so we can talk about the next steps for both the use of digital resources and its relationship to the actual textual basis for them. We're going to be deploying ways for there to be research workshops over the course of the academic year. We're trying to create teaching tools so that schools across the country, K through 12, can use the CNA in their own classrooms. So we're really trying to put together a program that makes the most sense in making the CNA as useful in somebody else's school and in somebody else's home as it is in Cambridge. That's what's next. That's what's now.
Where will we find more information about the Colonial North American Project, and how we can contact you if we still have questions about how to use it, or if we'd like more information about one of your workshops?
Well, the best place are one of these unwieldy web addresses, Colonial North American, all one word, .library.harvard.edu or library.harvard.edu/colonial, or you can just Google Colonial North America Project at Harvard. That is the best way to go ahead and get into what we have done already and as we continue to build it. To get in contact with me, my email is probably the best way. That's Stoermer, Stoermer, @fas.harvard.edu.
Taylor Stoermer, thank you for taking us through the Harvard University Library's Colonial North American Project and for showing us how we can best use it.
Thank you so much, Liz. This has really been a pleasure.
In episode 92, Sharon Block revealed that online research is about what we can do and what we can find. And Taylor just revealed a lot of what we can do and find with the Colonial North American Project. The CNA is still in development. The project team is still working on optimizing our ability to search the tens of thousands of historical sources within its digital archive. However, as Taylor mentioned, the CNA can still help us find and make unexpected connections when we use it to find information. Even if you don't have a historical or genealogical research project, looking at and reading historical records can be a lot of fun. And the Colonial North American Project allows us to do this freely and right from the comfort of home. You will find a link to the Colonial North American Project, information about how to contact Taylor, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/093. Ben Franklin's World takes a lot of time and energy to produce. If you enjoy it, would you tell your friends, family, and acquaintances about it? The best way to grow an audience for a podcast is by word of mouth support. I love early American history, and I want to help more people learn about it. So telling people about the show would be a huge help to me. Finally, do you have a history or genealogy research project? I'd really love to know what it is. Let me know what you're working on by sending an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.